Now it's time for the Fire Emblem game everyone in the West actually got first. Smash Bros. Melee introduced us to Marth and Roy, and Advance Wars was doing well, so Intelligent Systems figured everywhere outside of Japan should get a chance to enjoy Fire Emblem games too. However, this one for the Game Boy Advance is actually the 7th game in the series called Fire Emblem Rekka no Ken, or Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade, but we know it simply as Fire Emblem, kinda like how Final Fantasies 4 and 6 were changed to Final Fantasy 2 and 3 overseas when they first came out.
I've already gone deep into this in the last video, so feel free to give it a look if you want a little more detail. But Shozo Kaga, the creator of Fire Emblem, didn't come back for this one. He worked on Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light from 1990 all the way to Thracia 776 in 1999, and then never returned to the series. Blazing Blade, which is what I'll refer to this game from now on, only took around a year to make after the previously released game The Binding Blade, the one that has Roy in it, with Blazing Blade acting as a prequel to that game set 20 years in the past, and was directed by Taiko Kaneda and Kentaro Nishimura. Apologies if I butchered those names. Originally, it was only estimated for Blazing Blade to take 7 months to finish, but because of multiple features being added, development time had to be increased. From what I've seen of Binding Blade, I don't imagine there was too much extra work that needed to be done. Looking at them side by side, there doesn't seem to be that much difference between them, aside from the obvious artwork involved. But I haven't played that one yet, so I couldn't say for sure. For Blazing Blade, I'll be using the Wii U port for this review, which is the cheapest way to get it nowadays, as getting a legit GBA copy is fairly pricey these days. Not as much as Shadow Dragon on the DS, but still more than some might be comfortable with. The continent this time is in Eliwood, where a millennium ago, humans and dragons would live peacefully with one another. But one day humanity turned on the dragons to banish them, causing an all-out war known as the Scouring. In the end, the dragons mysteriously vanished and man was left to rebuild their homeland. Cut to present day, you, the player, take on the role of this game's strategist, though that doesn't mean you get to create your own avatar or anything like that. The characters just break the fourth wall by talking to you directly, and you never get to answer back. You just sort of blindly agree to whatever they ask you to do. Avatars wouldn't be in the series until Mystery of the Emblem for Japan and Fire Emblem Awakening for everyone else. All you get to do in Blazing Blade is type in your name, your gender, and your date of birth. Why do you need to put in your date of birth? Well, apparently, depending on what month you choose, this determines your affinity with a particular spell, like fire, ice, or wind, influencing what's known as a tactician's bonus. By default, your units will have a small boost in evasion against that affinity, but if any of your units are born with the same affinity as you are, their hit rate and evasion will increase a little further. After finishing the game, the evasion rate gets better each time you earn one of the 5 stars in your overall rank that changes depending on how many units live by the end, how many turns it took you, and also the amount of funds, experience, and kills you've acquired. This is all probably not something you'll notice that much significance towards, but I thought it was worth mentioning anyway. Moving on from that, I've decided to name myself Mai. Why, you may ask? I don't know, I just like the name Mai. As you begin the game, you seem to be found unconscious by a green-haired girl named Lindis, or Lynn for short. Bandits then immediately arrive out of nowhere for you and Lynn to fight your way out of, afterwards meeting a couple of soldiers in a nearby town called Ken and Sane. More bandits appear afterwards who seem to be paid to obtain Lynn's head for reasons she's unaware of. But once they're all cleared, Ken and Sane inform Lynn and us that she's in reality the current heir to the throne of Kalen, one of the territories located in the country of Lycia. Both of her parents have unfortunately passed, but she still has a grandfather waiting for her as he looks after her spot until she returns. However, it appears that Lynn's granduncle has been plotting to steal her throne for himself by continuously attempting to kill Lynn and her grandfather, which is why we keep running into bandits. Lynn and her new companions prepare to battle her granduncle by obtaining the sacred blade Manikati that only she can wield, and then as the party make their way over to Kalen, they protect a young bard named Nils from assassins who are part of an evil organization known as the Black Fang. His captured sister, Ninian, also seems to have been rescued by another mercenary named Eliwood, the son of the Marquess in the land of Farah, and eventually becomes the father of Roy by the Binding Blade, which is likely why a lot of people confused Eliwood for him when this game came out. Once the siblings are rescued, the gang finally make it to Kalen and have one last duel with Lynn's granduncle. After his defeat, Lynn has a touching reunion with her grandfather, and that's the end of her story, coming to about 4.5 hours, so where the hell's the rest of the game? Well, now it's a year later, and the focus is put on Eliwood, who's looking for his missing father. Seems like it's basically going to be a retread of Lynn's story, but it isn't quite like that. The Black Fang have wreaked more havoc in an effort to take over the world and are being manipulated by a sorcerer named Nurgle. That sounds like a mouthwash brand.
Nurgle, one rinse and that plaque disappears like magic.
Eliwood is also joined by his best friend Hector, the younger brother of the current Lord of Ostia. Later on, the two join up with Lyn again, and they eventually reunite with Nils and Ninian. Nurgle's evil plan is to absorb as much of what he refers to as quintessence, the life force of all living beings that gives him more power, and he wants to use Nils and Ninian as a means of opening the Dragon's Gate to bring back the dragons and start another war. The siblings also turn out to be half human, half dragon, which is why they're able to open the gate in the first place. The three lords at some point need to find the legendary weapons to defeat Nurgle and slay the dragons if need be, including the titular Blazing Blade. Ninian gets captured multiple times. The party find Nurgle again and kill him off as he opens the Dragon's Gate. 3 dragons pop out, but Ninian uses her strength to banish 2 of them, while the last one acts as the final boss of the game. Yeah, sorry for that spoiler there, but trust me, dragons are like the monster of the week in these games. That, and I really wanted to mention how awesome this thing is for a Game Boy Advance game. I mean, just look at it. The detail on the sprite is exquisite, it has a very threatening appearance, and it's freaking huge. What a great final opponent to close the game off. Nils and Ninian seal the gate from inside, the lords return to their respective kingdoms, and everyone's living the good life another year later until the Binding Blade eventually happens. I already mentioned this in the last video, but I'm not a Fire Emblem player who looks at these stories too deeply. That's what folks like Shane Brained are for. A lot of them in my eyes are just long adventures from one side of the continent to another, meeting new characters and dealing with any threats along the way. I enjoy the stories enough as I'm playing through them, but I'm not invested enough to search for any hidden meanings. I look at these games from a more basic perspective. And as you may have guessed, I've skipped over a lot of details with Blazing Blade's plot synopsis, partly due to not give it away more than I already have, but also that a lot of it doesn't really matter in the end, not even the Fire Emblem itself. It's needed as part of a ceremony for the Prince of Byrne, and that's it. The Blazing Blade had greater importance than the Fire Emblem did. However, to give credit where credit's due, the story is expectedly told a lot better here and in future games than how Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light portrayed it. Usually, where I think Fire Emblem games greatly succeed is handling its lineup of characters. And while I don't think the villains are anything that interesting, including Nurgle, who was just sort of one note to me, the heroes are engrossing enough, and the 3 lords in particular have some good chemistry together. I do wish we got to spend a bit more time with Lyn, though. I was enjoying having a nice simple story of the rightful heir to Caelin's throne traveling across a league with her friends to defeat her evil granduncle and meet with her grandfather after not seeing each other for so long. But that story thread's over before you know it, which was a little disappointing. Lyn's tale is meant to act as one giant tutorial, helping newcomers understand how a Fire Emblem game works, which I think anybody jumping in may find to be fairly helpful, even if it does go on for like 12 of the 30 plus chapters. But I was hoping by the end Lyn's story would lead to something more, and it just kinda stopped before it really started. Not that I didn't enjoy Eliwood and his tale too, he's pretty likable and the romantic subtext between him and Ninian can be quite sweet, but this one had slightly too much going on at once. I do find it pretty interesting, however, that we aren't told whether or not humans and dragons will ever coexist with each other again. It's all left to the imagination, but it doesn't feel like one of those open-ended story threads that's just done for laziness. The game also gets way harder once you start Eliwood's story, which may throw you off from the more forgiving chapters you do in Lyn's tale. Finishing Blazing Blade for the first time also unlocks Hector's tale if you want more Fire Emblem action, offering the same game from Hector's perspective and a few exclusive chapters to play through. I haven't bothered with it too much right now because I've got a lot of other Fire Emblem games to get through and the extra chapters are rather far apart, but I'm sure I'll get to it properly at some point. I believe Hector's tale is meant to be more difficult than Eliwood's as well, so yeah, no thanks, I'm too much of a noob for that at the moment. Gaiden chapters first introduced in Thracia 776 are also available to play through if you meet certain conditions, like having at least one of your NPC units alive during Chapter 16, or visiting this northwestern village in Chapter 13 to unlock the Gaiden chapter holding the character Merlinus. You're given the option to not do the preceding Gaiden chapter if you don't want to, as the game claims they're harder than the normal chapters, but I didn't really notice that much difference in difficulty personally, and I strongly recommend doing the one with Merlinus anyway. Recruiting him allows you to place a convoy on the battlefield at the start of each map should you wish to do so, which you may as well because while the convoy does take damage and will break if it loses all of its health, Merlinus won't die and he'll be back in the next chapter. The only penalty is not being able to store or take away anything until the current chapter's done. Obviously, from a graphical and audio standpoint, it's only natural that going from the original Fire Emblem to the 7th game in the series is going to be a really big leap. The overhead sprites, backgrounds, and terrain are simple looking, but there's an amount of charm to the simplicity that I think suits Fire Emblem well, and the portraits used during conversations are nicely detailed. Props to Sachiko Wada for her work on the character designs as well. Unfortunately, I can't seem to find a picture of her for full credit, but everyone has a nice distinct appearance to them that I can easily point out from a lot of other Fire Emblem protagonists. Although I find it funny how Eliwood's dad just looks like Eliwood slapped with a mustache on his face. I also like the still images that display during certain moments in the story. They're often breaths of fresh air compared to the same static deliveries for conversations over and over again. Where Blazing Blade really shines graphically, however, are the battle animations. You can turn them off to make the chapters move faster if this is like the 5th attempt to clear it without anyone dying, but I'd recommend leaving them on for at least a little bit, because my god do these sprites move smoothly. How long do you suppose it took to do these? The audio design's pretty top notch as well. I think the menu selection noise might be slightly too loud, but man do I love getting critical hits in this game. You watch that flashy animation play and are greeted with what I believe to be one of the most satisfying sounds ever heard in a video game. And topping that off is seeing the enemy's humongous health bar dwindle away in one strike. Oh, it's coming, and... that feels good. The soundtrack isn't too bad either, though not much I can really remember aside from the main theme, the battle music during your turn, and Together We Ride, the tune that plays when you recruit a new character. I first heard these in Smash Bros. And really enjoyed those renditions, but these are pleasing to the ears as well for Game Boy Advance limitations. I don't know why I didn't talk about the music much in the last video, but I guess there were so few songs that there wasn't a lot worth discussing anyway. But those 8-bit versions of the main theme and Together We Ride are quite good too. For the gameplay, a lot of things I covered in the Shadow Dragon video were all here and accounted for, but as you can expect, a huge number of improvements have been made for a much better experience. Same as before, you and your enemies take turns guiding your units across a number of battlefields to kill each other, where your guys will earn experience points for every enemy they kill, or just get themselves involved in a fight to begin with for not as many. The maximum level they can reach being 20, with each level giving the characters a small increase in random stats. Even the curates can gather XP by healing as well as dodging this time, and the same goes for the added Dancer and Bard classes that only Nils and Ninian carry. After performing next to a chosen unit, that same character can act again before you finish your turn, which was so helpful for given situations. I almost always make sure I have one or the other in my current team, and I'll always reset if they happen to die because of how handy they are. Many of the changes between this game and the original stem from genealogy of the Holy War in Japan, but for us, we've had these additions from the start. For example, unlike Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, where you couldn't see how far your units could move, Blazing Blade highlights the amount space to save time and make things easier to plan accordingly. By clicking on any specific enemy, you can also check their movement patterns on top of their attack range as a means of preventing your units from getting into trouble during the opponent's turn. You sadly can't permanently leave their spaces available to see, but it's better than what we had in the original game. And if you accidentally find yourself in harm's way, some units can rescue their injured companion and keep them under their wing until you decide to drop them off. Villages and huts are available to visit again for some tips and goodies, but now every unit can step inside a village as opposed to only Marth like in Shadow Dragon. You may even obtain items that'll promote your units to a stronger class once they're past level 10, except for the 3 lords that can only upgrade via story progression. I didn't really mention it in the last video, but Marth wasn't able to be promoted at all for some reason, even in the remake. But I'm glad that Lyn, Eliwood, and Hector get better treatment here, and it was an awesome moment when they finally got promoted so you can plow through enemies. Hector is an utter monster by the time he's upgraded and ended up gathering some of the most kills, although Dorcas was a bit of a powerhouse himself, especially after he was promoted to a berserker. Yes, there's a character in this game called Dorcas, and why would I keep him around? Because his name is friggin' Dorcas. One of the best changes though is that preparations can now be made before starting a map. You're still restricted on how many units you're allowed to bring into battle, but now you can also take stuff out of the convoy, which is a lot larger in space than it was in the original Fire Emblem, as well as trade between units, use consumable items, or pay a fortune teller to advise you on how best to proceed through the chapter in case you need the assistance. This, needless to say, is 100 times better than the way Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light handled inventory management, but you can still have your units trade stuff in the middle of a chapter if you need something there and then. I kinda wish you could buy equipment before the map begins, but there are still stores on the battlefield that units can access again to replace any durable weapons, spells, and staves, which you can now buy as many as you can afford without worrying about inventory space. If you're full up, you can choose to send it straight to the convoy. Fun fact, if you happen to own the rare bonus disc for Mario Kart Double Dash along with a GameCube to GBA link cable, you'll gain access to 2 extra songs for the sound test and some items to help you if you need it, with no limit to how many times you can make the transfer. Preparations are something to especially take note of when regarding the famous weapons triangle that's in many Fire Emblem games, where swords have a greater advantage over axe wielders, axes have advantage over lance wielders, and lances having advantage over sword wielders. Since the binding blade, there's also been a magic triangle to consider in addition to the weapons triangle. In this case, anima magic, i.e. fire, ice, wind, and lightning, are better at fending off light spells, light magic can overpower dark magic, and dark magic can overpower anima spells. These triangles have added a huge layer of extra strategy that Fire Emblem games strongly recommend you abuse for clearing chapters with greater ease. But ever since Fire Emblem Echoes, Shadows of Valentia, and Fire Emblem Three Houses, these are no longer around for reasons unknown. If you're unsure of how best to approach an enemy, then thankfully Blazing Blade brings over the battle forecast to show you and your enemy's odds just before engaging in battle, including hit rate, damage, and a chance of a critical attack. You can still check the stats of yours and the enemy's units if you want to, but this is just so much faster. I'm fine with simply having my units step in front of their foes and see how they'll fare up against them, acting appropriately to my current situation. This also makes it a lot easier to reduce casualties because we have the return of permadeath as series tradition, and unlike Shadow Dragon, there aren't any mid-chapter save points to activate, nor is there a rewind feature to go back to a previous turn like the Switch port gave you, so be prepared to see that GBA boot up screen a hell of a lot. You now have 3 lords to worry about as well instead of just Marth if you don't want an instant game over. Yay. For every action you perform, Blazing Blade also does a quick save, so if a character ends up perishing, or if you've made a slight miscalculation, too bad, there's no changing it. You try resetting the Game Boy and loading up your save again, it takes place right at that last action you just did with the same results every time. They thought of everything to prevent you from abusing saves. They didn't account for the future Wii U port having save states though, but I chose not to use it personally, unless I make the same moves every time to save efforts, because, well, that's sort of cheating. I know I didn't have a problem doing it with Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, but that's a 30-year-old Famicom game which hasn't aged well, compared to an early 2000s Game Boy Advance game that still holds up for the most part. Once again, more units can be recruited to fill up the numbers as long as you have the right unit out in the field, and neither them nor the recruitable character dies prematurely. Unfortunately, there still isn't always a clear idea of who you should be using to hire the new recruit. A hell of a lot better than the original Fire Emblem without a doubt, as sometimes there will be a short scene showing that they're unsure of the side they're currently on. This is mainly a way to let you know to look out for them, and occasionally they'll mention the name of the unit to include in your selection. But that doesn't happen every time, and when it's not instead one of the 3 lords, it's a little tricky to find out. Minor nitpick anyway, and that also goes for the support system carried over from Genealogy of the Holy War and beyond. It's a great idea where if 2 specific units battle near each other a certain amount of times, those units are able to have conversations to shed more light onto them and improve their bonds, which in turn gives them a significant boost in stats as they continue fighting close by. Bonds with units can level up to 3 times between rank C, B, and A, and when you've met the requirements, moving up a rank requires that you have one of the units stand next to each other and talk to them. No one unit is able to be friends with absolutely everybody, but you can check which units can socialize with whom via the extras menu in the title screen. Not the most convenient spot, but better than not having anything whatsoever. A slight issue I have with the support system in regards to Blazing Blade is that each character only has a small amount of units they're allowed to bond with, meaning if any of them die, that's one less person to potentially interact with and make your favorite units stronger. What doesn't help, at least for me, was that since a number of the maps are fairly wide in space and with how much the enemies like to spread themselves apart, that didn't give me a lot of opportunities for 2 units to support one another and improve their ranks. By the end of the game, I didn't get to see many of the conversations or gain a boost in stats between 2 characters, and that's partly my fault for not finding the support menus until after finishing the Blazing Blade, but I wasn't always thinking, what can I do to clear the chapter and keep my units close together? I'm just thinking, what can I do to demolish this wave of enemies as smoothly as possible? This is also taking into account that Blazing Blade has different objectives for each map, whether it be as simple as seizing territory like in the original, or it could be that you need to fend a base for a set amount of turns, kill a boss, or protect an NPC, all of which does offer a nice variety to keep you on your toes. Some maps will even have different weather conditions and stage hazards to add more tension, like rain affecting the amount of space spaces everybody can move until it temporarily stops, and the infamous fog of war that limits everybody's visions. You can see the map okay, but the enemies won't appear until you're nearby them. I hated these because the enemies have no problem seeing where I am, and are capable of attacking me whenever they want, but I can't do the same if I accidentally bump into them. It always feels like the enemies have too much of an advantage over me. You can leave torches you have on standby to act as vantage points, but if you're moving all the time and killing the enemies along the way, there's not much purpose for it if you ask me. All in all, I never look forward to these kinds of maps, and I was doing so well to maintain an empty graveyard up until chapter 26, which just so happened to be another hellish fog of war chapter, and right near the end, two of my units just had to eat dirt. Friggin' kill me. You know what, I've never really liked the pirate ship levels in Fire Emblem games either. They're so cramped in space, there's very little you can do to avoid encountering enemies during their turn. These sections are always just annoying to deal with. That and the desert levels for permanently restricting everybody's movements, especially against cavaliers. My two least favorite chapters would have to go to chapter 18X and chapter 28. Chapter 18X has this asshole sorcerer casting some sort of spell that stops all magic users from attacking, and he has a stupidly high amount of HP and evasion, so it takes a lot of luck to kill him. But that's not the worst part. If you can't defeat him in a single turn, he'll cower away and come back in a later chapter to make things harder for you. What's more is that when he does run away, that clears the magic nullification, but it also means the boss of this chapter is able to attack now with his ridiculously powerful spells, so it's best to first get rid of him with regular weapons, and then go after the sorcerer, if you can even land a hit at all. I gave it a few tries, but it didn't take long for me to run out of patience, so I moved on and just accepted the inevitable. I'm glad that killing him is at least optional, but that's still really irritating. Chapter 28 honestly really isn't that hard to clear despite having so few units in your squad for this one. It just gets very annoying once you reach the boss, who seems to land a hit no matter how low his chances are, and the damage output is pretty damn excessive. He's equipped with a tomahawk axe that can also be used as a ranged weapon, so you can't even fight back if he tries to attack you, unless that unit can also attack from a distance, and he's standing right near the space you need to seize too. There's gonna be some struggle with him. Bring your most powerful troops for this chapter, and be sure to reposition them appropriately. That's something else you can also do now. You know though, aside from a few shortcomings, I'm surprised at how well Blazing Blade has held up after all these years, especially considering this has been my first time playing it. I was expecting there to be some signs of age, but remarkably I found very little of it. It isn't my favorite Fire Emblem game, but it's a classic for a good reason. Blazing Blade's a decent title to start with for newcomers to the series thanks to Lynn's Tale and the healthy amount of tutorials. The difficulty, while tough and has its share of bullshit, never feels impossible, and the cast of characters are pretty enjoyable to hang out with, even more so if you unlock the support conversations. Try it out on an emulator first though, before buying the Wii U port or an actual GBA copy if you can find one that isn't a bootleg, and see if you're able to come to grips with it. I think Fire Emblem Awakening and Three Houses are better options for starting, but Blazing Blade's perhaps a little more straightforward. Give it a try nevertheless.
Thank God this video wasn't as long as the Shadow Dragon one, and I imagine the next Fire Emblem video will be even shorter when we talk about the Sacred Stones, also for the Game Boy Advance. I'll explain why when we get there, but for now, let's just say there aren't going to be a lot of new additions. Until then, thanks everyone for watching, stay safe, stay healthy, and if you'll excuse me, I have some shadowy business to take care of. Now it's time for the Fire Emblem game everyone in the... everywhere outside of Japan... Figured everywhere outside of Japan should get a chance to do what? So Intelligent Systems figured they figured something, but I couldn't tell you without memorizing my line properly. Or Fire Emblem: The Blazing Blade, or that everywhere outside of Japan.